cetaceans do spend their entire life in the water, but they do have to breathe air. So they still have to come up to the surface to breathe, but then they will be diving to depths in order to find their food. So they are going to need to be able to conserve oxygen and have a lot of adaptations in order to be able to dive to depths for a period of time in order to capture their food. So there's several adaptations that cetaceans have in order to be able to dive to depths for great periods of time. And one of those adaptations is the ability to conserve oxygen. So they have several ways that they can conserve oxygen. They can actually reduce their heart rate, so they slow down the rate at which their heart beats. And as they slow down their heartbeat, that means that the blood is traveling through their body at a slower rate, which means the oxygen and carbon dioxide rate of exchange in between the blood and the body cells is going to slow down, which is going to reduce the need that that animal has for oxygen. So that's going to help them to conserve the oxygen that they have. They also have the ability to store oxygen in both their muscles and their blood. So they actually have this protein called myoglobin in their muscles that is similar to hemoglobin in the blood, which is the protein that carries oxygen in the blood. So they have this protein myoglobin in their muscles, and so before they dive, they'll actually take a couple deep breaths, and what they're doing is they're getting lots of oxygen into that blood and then transferring it into their muscles and storing it in their muscles. So as they're diving, as the blood is running out of oxygen, then they can pull on those reserves that is stored in their muscles. So they can store oxygen in their muscles, but they can also store oxygen in their blood. So cetaceans actually have a higher blood count than other mammals would in order to be able to carry lots of oxygen in their blood. So they're able to store oxygen in their blood as well. They also shut down blood flow or extremely slow it down to their extremities. So things like their flippers and also their fluke, they'll slow down blood flow to those extremities because they don't need as much oxygen. And so what this does is it keeps blood flow to the important parts of the body like the brain and the heart and the internal organs. So it helps to keep those areas oxygenated, which allows for them to reduce the amount of oxygen that they use. They're also going to have to deal with great changes in pressure as they dive down to depths in order to get their food. And if you've ever heard of the bends, so the bends is something that divers can get, like people can get if they dive to depths for any period of time and then they come up too fast. They can get this condition called the bends. And so what happens is when we breathe in air, there's actually quite a bit of this gas called nitrogen gas in air. And at sea level, the nitrogen gas doesn't really get dissolved into your blood. Like it goes into your lungs, but it doesn't get dissolved into your blood and carried around. Well, if you go to depths in water, where you're going to be under greater amounts of pressure, that pressure can actually force that nitrogen from your lungs into your bloodstream. And so what happens to people is when they dive down to these depths, they get nitrogen into their bloodstream, and then if they come up too fast, that nitrogen actually doesn't have time to diffuse out of their bloodstream back into the lungs to be exhaled. If they come up too fast, that nitrogen actually comes out of the blood in the form of bubbles. And so basically you get bubbles in your blood, which can cause blockages of blood flow. It's very painful, and it can actually kill you. So very bad. So people cannot dive to depths for any great length of time and then come up very fast, whereas cetaceans can. And the reason why they can is really, really cool. They can actually collapse their lungs and their rib cage. So what they do is they take those lungs and those rib cage, and as the pressure increases, that pressure collapses those lungs and that rib cage, and it forces air from the areas of the lung where it can, like that nitrogen can be absorbed into the blood, into higher levels of the respiratory system where the nitrogen can't be absorbed into the blood. So where the membranes are thicker and such. So what happens is, because they can collapse those lungs and that rib cage, nitrogen doesn't get into the blood in the first place, which means cetaceans can come up as fast as they want, and they don't have to worry about getting the bends because there's no nitrogen in their blood to give them the bends. So that's pretty cool. That's pretty awesome that they can do that. Whereas, like, if you were to collapse your lungs and your rib cage, it's called a pneumothorax, and it's a life-threatening condition, and it's not good. Whereas cetaceans, as they rise back to the surface, those lungs and those rib cage naturally expand, and they're fine. So they're pretty awesome in that way. Their physiology, cetaceans' physiology, actually also allows for them to dive to depths for long periods of time. So they're actually able to hold their breath for a longer period of time before they get the urge to breathe. So basically, you've got this part in your brain that monitors the levels of carbon dioxide in your blood. And when those carbon dioxide levels in your blood get to a certain point, that's when you start to feel this urge to breathe. So if you were to take a deep breath and hold it, at first you'd be fine, and you're like, okay, I can hold my breath for a while. And then eventually you start to feel like, okay, like, you know, I kind of need to breathe now. And that signal that you need to breathe gets more and more urgent the longer and longer you hold your breath, until eventually you can't hold your breath anymore and your brain takes over and it forces you to breathe. So these animals actually have a brain stem that is not as sensitive to the levels of carbon dioxide in their blood, so they can go for a longer period of time before they start to feel that urge to breathe, so that they can concentrate on finding their food without this distraction of like, hey, you need to go up to the surface and breathe now. So it's good. It helps them to be able to find their food more efficiently. This is a picture to try and help you see how the lungs and the rib cage collapse and how it prevents the bends. So basically, when the lungs and the rib cage collapses, it takes all of this air that's here in the alveoli where the gas exchange takes place in between the blood and the air, and it collapses it and prevents there from being a place for that air to be exchanged, for that nitrogen to be exchanged. So it prevents the bends. This is a picture just to give you a summary of the different diving adaptations. So the muscles are going to contain a lot of myoglobin that are going to store oxygen. They're going to have a higher volume of blood. Their heart rate is going to decrease. They're going to shut off blood flow to the extremities, and their brainstem is going to be less sensitive to the carbon dioxide. They also have another adaptation for diving. Their respiratory and their digestive systems are actually completely separate. So that means that they can actually open their mouth underwater and swallow their food without the fear of choking. So when you eat, okay, you have a common opening between your respiratory and your digestive system at the back of your throat, and it's called a pharynx. And so that's a common passageway for both air and food. And you've got a little flap of tissue at the back of your pharynx called the epiglottis that will either cover your windpipe if you're swallowing food, so that the food goes down your esophagus and into your stomach. And then if you're breathing, the epiglottis closes your esophagus so that air goes down into your lungs. The reason you can choke and die because if you get food stuck in your windpipe, and so you're no longer able to breathe. So you have a common opening in between those two systems in the back of your throat. Cetaceans do not. So they have a completely separate respiratory system and digestive system so that they can swallow things underwater without the fear of drowning. That also means if you ever saw Finding Nemo, and you know the part where like Dory and Marlin are in the mouth of the whale, and then they go down the throat, and then they come out the blowhole, that would never happen because they're not connected.